I'm really excited to be here. As mentioned, like this is full circle for me. 10 years ago, I had a vision and passionate about graduate school research and needed a place to build my first prototype along with my two co-founders, but our first prototype and scale up the company to now we are building our first commercial plant out in Washington State. And I've come back to Activate to really support founders back where I was 10 years ago. And we have two amazing founders, Dienden and Chris. And so I'm eager to have them introduce themselves. And I would say, when you introduce yourself and your company, can you also talk about kind of the origin story, starting at the beginning, like what inspired you to take your scientific work out of the lab and turn it into a company? Go with Chris
Should
first.
I go ahead? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Chris Thomas. I'm the CEO and founder of Return, where we are engineering novel, sustainable materials to replace plastics in packaging. And where this began with, I mean, there's certainly a long story behind it, and I hope someone asks me and I can get to the details of it. But I had a PI during my PhD that put me in a lot of the right situations to give me the pieces that I wanted to build up into a company. So, for example, I actually, day one, started graduate school at the Beijing Forestry University in China, where I was working on upcycling of waste and lignocellulosic materials into components for biofuels. Then I came back to the US and had the opportunity to work with another startup company called Full Cycle Bioplastics, which was producing polyhydroxyalkanoates or PHAs targeted for food packaging. And so I saw a connection, a potential connection between these two things, this waste upcycling component, this creation of these novel materials for packaging to enhance sustainability and deal with microplastics in the environment. And 2 years before I graduated in 2021, so in 2019, I had an idea for a new technology, and I changed my entire thesis for my PhD and targeted towards a technology that I thought could be actually built into a startup company. So I guess it was a little bit of like a flip in that I didn't work in the lab and say, oh, this could be applied. I actually went to the lab specifically to create something that I thought could be used as a basis for a startup company that could get materials out there that could help create positive change in our world.
Wow,
Yeah.
great. Changing your thesis. That's awesome. Okay, Dianden. Thank
Yeah, unlike Chris, I didn't change the topic of my PhD thesis. Actually, the story actually started from my PhD. Hi, everyone. My name is Dian Zhao. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Carbon Infuse. And at Carbon Infuse, what we are trying to do is basically converting industrial waste, like waste cement, steel slags, and CO2 emissions into building materials. And building materials, typically we can use it for, like cement substitutes or like any low carbon concrete applications. And my journey basically started during my PhD at Columbia. So I was studying like how CO2 could be permanently stored into minerals. So basically we are trying to react the CO2 with some like industrial byproducts, like with cement, steel slags, this kind of thing. And then basically we can turn the CO2 into the minerals. And the context for this is that, at that time, there were a lot of like emerging CO2 capture companies. But after capture, what happened to the CO2? They didn't know really how to deal with like this CO2 because there were not too many like CO2 utilization or storage companies. So I started thinking if we can, take this CO2 and maybe some other industrial waste, and then together we turn them into some stay minerals. And then these stay minerals, you can also use them for like construction or manufacturing. So basically we are like killing two birds with one stone. So we can achieve basic utilization and storage together. So I was really excited about this idea, and we were hoping that our research can basically make a like larger impact instead of just like staying inside the lab. So basically that pushed me to like start Carbon Infuse. And right now our goal is like pretty straightforward. We are trying to turn this CO2 into the building blocks that we can use for basically build everything around Earth. So that's like basically the start of our story. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, really inspiring. Um, I would say an entrepreneur, one of their main goals is to bring resources to bear to what they're doing. And so, can you both talk about, early on, how did you make the most of the resources available to you, whether it's shared lab space, grant funding, university partnerships, and particularly to build your first prototype? And Chris, you can.
Yeah, I was about to just offer it to Dian first. I didn't mean to
Yeah.
jump in. Would you like to go first in this one, Dian?
Oh, that's fine. You can go ahead.
Okay. Also, I just wanted to, I saw that there's like 200 people participating here. I didn't even acknowledge at the top. Thank you so much for everyone coming by to hear our stories. It's really cool and inspiring, and I hope you learned something interesting. Resources. Oh my God. At the start of this, I had to be incredibly scrappy. So technically I've been doing this for 4 years, but for the first 3 years, it was me doing whatever it took to keep the company alive, because I spun this out of SUNY ESF, a very small state school, no culture or history of really startups or startup support. It was a foreign concept to them. And so what I really had to leverage and find was folks and grant opportunities that had very aligned missions. And so, for example, I saw that the New York State DEC was partnering with the university to work on upcycling waste into materials that could help deal with PFAS in the environment. And so I went to the director of that program and I said, hey, what type of impact are you trying to have with this money you're about to spend, with the $10 million you're putting down? Like, are you trying to publish papers, or do you want to actually get this out into the world and make some change? And they're like, absolutely not. We don't, for the DEC, we're trying to actually tackle environmental pollution. We need to make real change. So I said, okay, if you want to make real change, you need to make something that's going to be commercializable. You can't just talk about this. You have an opportunity here to actually create technologies. And I told them about what I wanted to do with upcycling waste and sustainable materials, to create technologies that will be propagated into, the commercial world, replace toxic materials, and have that immediate impact. And so I think that type of storytelling, helped get my first chunk of funding there that I really kickstarted the whole project with. And I really relied very heavily on that storytelling, first on a very local basis, a lot of college specific and then regional specific grants and opportunities, before slowly building out to state and then federal funding. I think that covers the gist of it.
Awesome. Deandon?
Yeah, I think for me, yeah, I'm lucky that, I was at Columbia. So Columbia actually has kind of like a very strong support system for basically researchers or scientists who like to, explore commercialization. So at that time, basically at Columbia, there was like an accelerator program organized by basically Columbia's tech transfer office. And maybe, many of you have attended those kind of like programs. It's basically like entrepreneurship 101. So they will teach you basically what is like customer discovery and then what is like business canvas, this kind of thing. So, but that was really helpful for me because for myself, my experience always like, academia experience. I did my bachelor, I did my bachelor's degree until PhD, all within like, academia settings. And I didn't really have a lot of like industrial experience. And that really helped me basically start thinking not just about, the technology or the chemistry of our process, but about basically what, industry people really wants from like this kind of like technology or products. So I think that one was like very helpful and basically the first step of our journey. And then later we also joined like the famous NSF ICOR program. So we joined the regional one. And then the good thing of that program is that, they kind of like force you to do very intense like customer interviews. And then basically they have like very specific requirements, right? You have to finish like how many interviews within like 2 weeks or like 4 weeks. So basically I was forced to basically, take this like customer interview course almost like every day. So maybe for each day I had like, 3 to 4 calls. And that was really, eye-opening, especially, for like a basically scientist like me, because I spent a lot of time, basically doing experiments and collecting data in the lab, but I don't really, talk to that many industrial people. So I think that program was like indeed really, really helpful. And basically help us better understand, how we can potentially apply our technology into these like industry settings. And that basically also help us, try to prioritize, basically what technical milestones we need to achieve in the lab in order to have the proof of concept for our technology. And it also help you, not just like building something fancy, because like, as a scientist, sometimes we publish a lot of like very fancy papers and then using very fancy materials or technologies, but that's not for commercialization. Sometimes like what industry partners or people want, they really just want like very simple solution that can work to solve their problems. And I think after that, basically, I finished my PhD and everything at Columbia. And then I was like honored to, got accepted into Activate. And then, Activate always has been like a huge part of this. Because like what Activate Fellowship provides is not just like about the funding or about like the training. It's actually, the community, because like, we have like so many fellows within the community, and then you are like surrounded by this like very hardworking and very smart people trying to solve like the hardest problems in climate tech. So everyone generally want others to succeed. So we're just trying to help each other. So it just like makes your journey less alone, I guess, and then you feel always very supportive. So I think I'm like blessed to have this kind of like community here.
Yeah, appreciate that plug for Activate.
It's like
Yes,
an advertisement.
yeah. Yes, we are a community that supports scientists and engineers to become entrepreneurs and yeah, provide a ton of resources as well as funding. And really appreciate it. You all mentioned, lab space through universities and I-Corps programs, other kind of national state funding, talking with program managers directly and advocating for, commercial outcome in the case of PFAS with Chris. Um, so really love hearing all these things. And at 12, we did a very similar thing in our early days of really going after these state and federal fundings and programs. So next question is about de-risking the technology. And I'll just preface Dion, you can chime in first to change it up a bit. So, when you're doing deep tech, there's certainly technical risk in addition to financial risk, execution risk, all the other parts that other non-deep tech companies have to deal with. We also have the technical risk as well. And so, what were the first steps you took to de-risk your technology and prove that it could work in the real world?
Yeah, sure. So I think for us, like the risking starting with like proof, but the proof is not just about like, scientific proof, but also like commercial proof. So basically first on the technical side, early on, we focus on like making basically very small, but very consistent batches of our materials. So basically we use some like different industrial waste, and then we're trying to upcycle it and then using CO2 to activate the materials to make these like minerals that can be used for cement substitutes. And then after that, basically we incorporate these like minerals or basically our products into like, cement or like concrete. And then basically we prepare samples to do like the test that industrial people want. So we have like various like industry standards that basically allow you to, test like your materials based on these standards. And then this can include a lot of like different basically performance data like strength, durability. And sometimes, people may also want like some maybe, embodied carbon calculations. So we also did like life cycle analysis on those. So basically that was like the first step for like de-risking the technology. And then basically we are trying to show our basic customers or our partners that our materials actually can meet the performance or sometimes even beat them. So and in addition to the technical side, at the same time, we also, as I mentioned before, through like I-Corp and also like later on Activate, we actually did a lot of like customer discovery calls. And then we spoke with like hundreds of people actually across like the entire construction value chain. So the construction value chain is basically, we have like cement companies, which is very centralized like plants. And then we only have about like 100 plants in the US. And then later, after you produce cement. So cement and concrete, they're actually, two different materials, but sometimes like people are confused with it and use them interchangeably. But cement is usually, the gray powders that you can get from like Home Depot. And then concrete is actually, the composite. And then cement is just like one ingredient of concrete. So you mix cement with water, with sand and gravel, and then you make concrete. So we have the cement companies, and then for the next stage for the value chain, we have like concrete companies. And then concrete companies, they tend to be, smaller, and then they tend to be more localized. Because like when you want to ship your concrete to the construction site, there is like a time window that you can ship it, because otherwise, basically the concrete will set in your trucks. You don't want to break your trucks. And then after that, we have like the construction companies and then the property owners. So basically by interviewing like the entire value chain, we understand basically the landscape of this market, and then who will basically make the decisions of like adopting new materials. Because basically our new materials are, new to the market. We need to know that, across this entire chain, who actually has like the decision-making power to decide like what materials they use. So I think those like conversations were really like invaluable. And then it told us like also like what problems actually matter to them. And this was like the commercial proof we were trying to get. And also it helped us to, basically de-risk the market adoption side. So basically, we are trying to do this both. So, and I think this one is a very good approach, because as a scientist, sometimes we focus too much on the technology side, but we forget about like, what industry people really want. So I would, I think if I do it again, I would definitely even take more customer interview calls for this process. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really detailed explanation. And yeah, the cement concrete spectrum is real. All right, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think the NDN hit some really good points there as far as de-risking the commercial and market adoption. Like you can't overemphasize that. We need to be developing technologies that answer real problems, and there has to be a real market for answering those problems. And so I also did the I-Core program. Definitely would like to second a plug for that. That was super, super helpful. At first, I was like, oh, we have we have a technology to make new plastic materials. We're going to replace all the plastic in the world. And very quickly came to realize, no, plastic industry has its own thing going on. It's actually paper packaging that is where you want to go with a new plastic material, which was a really good learning at the time, because I already had a bunch of connections to the paper industry. But as far as connecting the need, so we talked to them and realized their issue was other biomaterials that they were trying to use were too expensive and or didn't have the right material properties to be drop-in manufacturable or hit the types of products that they want to create, right? So for example, one of those materials properties is melting temperature of a biopolymer. That can make it challenging for, like extrusion, coating, or screw press type manufacturing methods. And so I went and said, okay, we need to make something that's cheaper and we need to make something that's better. How are we going to do that? For cheaper, we went for the waste component. So we was actually at my favorite brewery when I lived in Syracuse still. It's called Willow Rock. If you're ever around, that's a great place to drop in if you want a nice IPA. I was there with my co-founder, Ryan, and I remember talking to the brewer. I was like, hey, Rockney, what happens to your spent grains when you're done? Like, oh, a lot of it gets thrown away. Cool. Can we grab some? So we took some of that, took it to the lab, used it to generate the next batch of materials that we were making. And, I should back up a little bit. The whole hypothesis behind the company was that I'd be able to make new PHA materials, novel polyhydroxyl alkanoate copolymers that the market hadn't seen before. And to be totally honest, I didn't know 100% that I was going to be able to make them. Like, we were banking on engineering bacteria and what was going to happen there. And I was just naive enough to not fully understand how difficult it can be to engineer bacteria, and got lucky. And so I remember taking those, feeding it to the new bacteria that we engineered, and then seeing the NMR printout, confirming the molecular structure. And I'm like, oh, holy crap, we actually did it. Here's these new copolymers that no one's ever seen before. And then go back and test material properties and see, yes, they do also lower the melting temperature like we were hoping they would. So that's real early stage stuff, but it was transformational as far as the potential where we could take the technology to answer these types of problems. Does that get at the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talk about, creating samples, understanding what the customer wants, going back to the lab, like seeing the data. And we had many of these like technology de-riskings as well at 12. One in particular was, when we first started off, we were an electrochemistry company. We were looking to convert carbon dioxide into ethanol. There was a huge value proposition, at which we had gotten in part from our I-Core program. And while we were doing customer discovery, we were also in the lab and we said, okay, well, making CO2 to ethanol directly is a bit of a challenging step. Like we don't have like great catalysts for it, but we do have good catalysts for CO2 to CO. And so why don't we use those good catalysts to at least test our ideas on the reactor side? So we're kind of taking a known entity of a good catalyst and using it to test some of our novel ideas around the reactor design. And it just so turns out that as we were doing customer discovery, we ended up pivoting in the market into CO again due to I-Core, like having different customer discoveries. We realized that CO or carbon monoxide is actually a molecule that's used in industry for many different things, and that there is a high demand and need for kind of green or on-site modular CO production. So it was kind of this pathway that we had to de-risk the technology, also, intersected with where our pivots were going with our customer discovery. Um, so it just happened to be this really beautiful intersection that came about. And to that effect, that brings us to our next question. So I want to talk about kind of like pivots and turning points. I talked about this pivot in our kind of market analysis that we went from ethanol to CO. I'm wondering for you all, is there any kind of pivots you had in any categories within your company that were kind of defining moments where you either realized your technology or the market or application or execution or something that could have you move this forward from where it was previously to where you are now?
Should I get started? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Take it.
Yeah, so I think for us, the turning point it was like when we realized that, actually our research has a lot of potential to commercialize. And what I meant was basically, during like our technology development process, we realized that, a lot of like CO2, basically our technology is like the big category is CO2 mineralization. And then for a lot of like CO2 mineralization technologies, basically they require either like high temperature or high pressure or both in order for the CO2 to react with like their minerals or their feedstocks. And but for us, basically we develop a proprietary process and then we can significantly lower basically the reaction conditions. So we can actually run the whole process at room temperature and room pressure. So we figure out that that can actually change a lot of things because like if you can do your reaction at room temperature and room pressure, basically you can integrate your process into a lot of like different places. For example, like cement plant, steel plant, all this kind of thing. Because like if you use like low pressure, we can also use like directly flue gas from these industrial plants. So we don't need to rely on like other people to capture and purify the CO2 for us. So I think that's definitely, a turning point or like a inflection point for the technology development side. And I think for the commercialization side, I think at that time, because like a lot of people are really trying to, reduce like the CO2 emissions or the embodied carbon of like construction materials. And then so basically the most like carbon intensive construction material is basically cement. So for making 1 ton of cement, you will roughly, make a ton of CO2 actually. And then cement is actually a commodity that is used everywhere. And then, concrete is basically the most used material just after the second most used material just after water. So each year, because of this like enormous amount of like cement or concrete we use, so actually, the whole industry actually accounts for like 8% of the global CO2 emissions. So at that time, a lot of people are trying to look for these like solutions to trying to lower the embodied carbon of like building materials. So we figure out that our technology, if we can take CO2 and then turn them into minerals, so basically we can sequester CO2 into our products, and then you can use our materials to basically make concrete and build your like infrastructure. So I think that's like a really cool idea. But the most important thing is that, because of like the room temperature and room pressure process that we can use. Actually, with our materials, we don't typically have like a green premium. And sometimes, like, because of like this process, we can even have a green discount. This means that, when we use our materials for concrete, sometimes it can be even cheaper than cement. So I think that's also like a very important milestone for like the commercialization process. So we did the techno economy model, and then we figure out the economics of it. And then we think that it has a lot of potential because giving this like low cost. That's why we started trying it. And then later, basically, we apply for like, different accelerator programs, fellowship, and grants. And then we basically get started. And then we basically transition from like lab research to basically commercialization. Yeah.
Thank you. Hand it over to you, Chris.
Sure, yeah, and inflection points in the company. I mean, so there's one I glossed over really quickly before. So, for me, having the stream of tackling microplastic pollution, my attention was more on plastic packaging. Like, we were talking with my early founders, thinking about, oh, we're going to do something about water bottles, things like that, and then realizing very quickly that that's a totally separate market. They have totally separate drivers than paper-based packaging, and in fact, politics and vertical integration of supply chains has a really, really heavy hand in determining how technologies are considered and adopted. And so, pivoted away from plastic-based packaging into that paper packaging world. And it was there that, through slow customer discovery, saw that there's a need, saw things aren't working out, and that's nice. That was enough to get us those early grants. But eventually we had to get to a point like, is there, I talked about this at the top, a real market for this? So that is there a VC backable market, like something of potential, unicorn size? And it's difficult to get that kind of information at early stages through introductory calls. But, once we started getting prototype materials out there and potential customers started getting excited about it, it was sometime last year, early last year, I remember being on the phone with a North American director of business development for a very large chemical supply company. And I'm basically pressuring him. I'm like, Jim, if you want me to give you more material, you need to let me know how big of a market opportunity we're talking about here. And he's like talking about what I just sent him. He's like, listen, if you were able to supply this to me at scale right now, I'd be moving 10,000 tons within 8 months. And in my head, I do the quick math, I'm like 10,000 tons, that's a $60 million gross revenue right there. I'm like, okay, we're talking a real market now. And so I think after that, I was feeling like we were playing in the right space, and this was a direction that could grow pretty big.
Wow, love that. That's some quick math. I was like eager to hear what that number was too. And that's a really big number. So really awesome to hear these talking with customers and again like having this development, having data uh, really leads to these inflection points. So we're coming up on our last kind of like schedule question before we go to the audience questions. So audience members, please continue to put questions in the Q&A. Um, so for this last question, maybe Chris, you can go first. And I'll actually um, share something from mine once I after I answer a question, but questions about lessons learned. So like looking back, like what's one piece of advice you'd share with founders working to commercialize hard science? Um, so for me, I would say that having when my my co-founder actually coined this term, but having like the appropriate level of scrappiness is something you want to kind of have and update as you move along the way. So, we did this in our early days by having, um, we were co-located at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. We got free lab space as part of that, Activate program, but we also had grant funding that allowed us to, purchase supplies and so forth without diluting our cap table. And then also really looking at, as we went to piloting and scale up, co-locating with joint development partners or co-locating at these facilities that have pilot plants so that you don't have to build like the balance of plant, but can instead just build your novel piece of it. That also goes for manufacturing partners, like, not having to build the whole system, but just your core piece. And with enough excitement, like, someone saying they can push material in 8 months, that level of excitement, like that's what you want to kind of leverage and see, like, how can you get the scale much cheaply. So that was definitely a big lesson learned that we had in kind of looking back, that, there are ways in which, um, with hindsight, you can see like, oh, we could have done that much cheaper and we could have, um, you know, leveraged partnerships and so forth. So with that, I'll kick it to Chris to think of any, like, share any lessons learned.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to, I think it was my first regional NSF I-Core seminar, and someone was talking about what founders need to have, and goes over a bunch of different qualities that all kinds of VC folks and others have valued. And they're like, well, let me give you the top three that you need. And it was grit, grit, grit. And I'm like, at the time, like, I don't really know what this guy's talking about. And now years later, I'm like, oh, it's because it's so difficult to commercialize a deep technology. And it really is. So, I mean, if there's any, early founders or prospective founders out there, it is probably far more difficult than you think it will be. And it's hard to measure because difficulty is in that personal lived experience. And so my advice and the way that I was able to get through is just making sure to have a really positive culture amongst that. And so, like, that's a big thing I work on doing with my own company, is making sure that when I bring new people in, or even for whoever's here, that it's a good place to be, like that you feel good coming in, because we're all working to do something that's so incredibly challenging, so frustrating. And sometimes, we're incredibly ambitious people by nature of being startup founders. I mean, like, you've done it, Etosha. Like, you started and you've changed things, which is amazing. And for me, still very far away from that, looking at that possibly over the horizon, it's daunting when you take a step back and like, oh my God, we're really betting on ourselves to do this. And so, having like a good family and a good support system to count on, and putting energy and focus on growing that, I think is super, super important for making everything else happen.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that optimism, grit, focus. Okay, Dion.
Yeah, I think also really resonate like what Itasa and Chris said. So basically, I think for early stage start, since we don't have a lot of like resources, and then definitely, leveraging partnerships is important. For example, like us, sometimes, if we need some like cement for testing, we will just like, ask our like cement company partners to send like free cement to us. So we don't need to, worry about, buying cement from somewhere and transporting them, this kind of thing. And I think having like a positive culture is also very important, because like, we always want to work with someone that is really positive, and then, has like, energy, and then that can really, encourage you to like moving forward. And I think from my lessons, I would say also, don't underestimate like the importance of like communications, and then basically, how to basically speak different languages to different like audience. Because like in hard science, sometimes like, we spend like years like doing experiments and collecting data in the lab. And then when we present our research, usually we present it like at a very deep technical level. And then we will explain, how the chemistry works, and then what fancy equipment or technology you use to do those like tests, and then what results you get. But I think when I step into the world of like commercialization, I mean, it's like a totally different story. You need to kind of like, reshape your stories. Because like, for example, you don't want to talk to your investors that, okay, oh, today we got this like really fancy crystal, like how difficult it is to make this kind of like crystal. I think they don't really care. So that's like the short answer. So you really need to like speak the language that they want to hear. So I think that is really important. So basically during this process, I learned how to basically communicate my ideas like in many different ways, to like engineers, investors, potential customers, and even like policymakers. And but in addition to that, in addition to communication, of course, like your fundamental science need to be correct first, and then you can do like the storytelling part. So I think that's also important. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Lessons in communication and tailoring the message to your audience, including investors who are not typically not scientists. Um, and yeah, really appreciate all your answers here. So, just looking at the Q&A, so Janet Ginsburg has a few questions here. The first one seems to be around kind of what it's like out there now, um, in the federal funding landscape for pre-seed funding. She mentions Department of Defense and Department of Health, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy as well, and kind of what's it like given like this change. And I can start that. Um, there's definitely been shifts in funding. There's been many founders at our stage, for example, who had OSED funding that they were awarded and that was pooled. And so that's really caused, I would say, strategic shifts in companies that are much further along. Um, I think for any technology, there's multiple value propositions. And so that's kind of what iCore is there for, is right to kind of hone in on which value proposition is really the path of least resistance, given the market conditions and where your technology would sit. And so if those market conditions change, like I think, reassessing the value proposition for your technology, I think is a prudent measure. And, grants, I would say, are part of a market condition, especially when you're kind of in your early stages, where if, you know, funding that maybe could have came from, uh, DOE, if that value proposition is no longer attractive to DOE, well then, maybe it would be to National Science Foundation or NASA or uh, Department of Transportation or NIST. I mean, all of these agencies offer um, small grant funding. And as far as I know, that they, in different levels are still issuing funds through those programs. So, that's my take on it. But Deanne or Chris, do y'all have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is like the other side of that. And so with that lack, definitely what I've seen is more of a focus by everybody on state resources. And so, not only are we getting more startups focusing on state resources, but also I just, realized this when I was on the phone with one of our academic partners today, that like universities are also feeling this and putting that focus on state resources. And so that means things that used to be maybe relatively easy grants or competitions to get a year ago are suddenly, receiving 3-4 times as many applicants as they've ever had and are far, far more competitive. And so I think this means to compensate for that, if you are depending on, I don't know, just throwing numbers out there, like a 10% success rate, spread across 20 different applications to get 2 grants, you need to put out 80 now if you want to get, the same level of funding. So there's definitely a reevaluation of that strategy there. And it does mean finding really critical ways to differentiate yourself from others, and like really making sure that you are doing something not only that fulfills a market need, but maybe positioning your startup company or idea in a way which is strongly differentiated from similar startups, which can be challenging because usually, like Dan and I, like there's probably lots of other companies you can find that are quite similar to what we're describing to you today. And so, like I think our challenge is to find ways that really make us different from that host of competitors in the landscape.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Deandra?
So I think I will second like what Chris mentioned. Right now, state resources are really important. And then for us, we are lucky to have like some, grant support from basically NYSERDA from the New York State. And then that is like really critical for basically, our technology development and commercialization. And I think in addition to that, for federal level kind of like support, I think it's still possible to get some, federal funding, especially like SBIR. I don't think like SBI will be like affected a lot like by this kind of like environment right now, because like basically for SBIR, especially NSF SBIR, you can explore like many different topics. So yes, and I think this one is like more for like government funding, federal and state. But in addition to that, there are also some like, depending on your areas, technology areas, there may be also some like philanthropy opportunities. You may have some like foundations who are like willing to, invest or donate into your areas. So I think those resources, if you can like leverage, then they will also be like super helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, love it. So state funding, diversifying resources, all good responses to this changing market and the grant landscape. Um, Another kind of question from Janet around kind of procurement, that touches on effectively like the green premium is a challenging one to sell to procurement departments. And Dunn specifically, you mentioned the green discount, which I thought was a really nice phrase. And maybe it's kind of a moment to double click on that and like how you talk about the green discount um, and yeah, how are your customers looking at it?
Yeah, so I think green premium, I think definitely is like a very challenging thing to do. For example, if your value proposition is mainly, CO2 reduction, I'm not sure if like people still like care that much in this kind of like environment. So I think instead of that, we should focus more, how to make your products either is like cheaper or like better. If it's like better, of course, you can like sell it at a like higher price, but it's not because of like the green premium, but it's because like your product performance is better. So I think right now what we are trying to build a carbon infused is basically, we are trying to treat our business as like a normal business. We are not relying on like either carbon credits or subsidy to in order to, succeed. So even in our techno economy models, we didn't even include any like carbon credits. We just like include basically the sale of our materials. So for our business model, although it has like two parts, like one is like CCUS, right? Carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The other part is like waste to value. But right now we mainly focus on the waste to value. We don't really, focus on like the business side of the CCUS. So I think basically because of this, I think we can be just like a normal business, but we just like happen to, help reduce the CO2 of their products. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Chris, did you want to add anything or we could go to another question?
I think he covered it very well.
Right, okay. There are a couple questions here just about scaling up. Kind of what are the challenges around that? Um, how are you thinking about mitigating potential risk to get the production scale? And what are some maybe frameworks to think about scale up? I can go first. What you guys think of, think of that? But yeah, I think for scale up, for a lot of that we like again going back to iCore, when you have the business model canvas, you have those 9 blocks, and you kind of think about each one of those blocks as like initial hypothesis, and each one of those blocks are an area you can kind of pivot around. Well, I think one of the things the business model canvas maybe doesn't kind of highlight as much because wasn't initially built for deep tech companies, but there is a scale up where I think the scale up like phase is one in which you almost have to look at like you have an initial hypothesis and you need to pivot around it and be strategic and do customer discovery even and kind of find the strategic partner that will bring your scale up. in the, path of least resistance way. And so, one way I've seen companies do this is there are some scale up facilities within government. So I'm familiar more with ones in California. So there's like a joint biological and energy institute where they have these 900-liter bioreactors, and companies can come in and use that reactor on a daily, monthly, weekly basis, or whatever. You kind of get into a CRADA and you utilize that. And I know of another company that was in the same cohort as mine, like they were able to get to that 900-liter size, which is basically pre-production or pre kind of commercial size, by leveraging those resources. It was very, very cheap to do so. There's also kind of these nonprofits out there. So SRI is another one, Stanford Research Institute. There's a company that basically leverage their facility, their researchers to be able to build a scaled up system and kind of think about getting to production and so forth. So that would be another kind of avenue of kind of just thinking of it as a strategic thing and pivoting and doing customer discovery around it, and talking to experts. Um, I don't know, Chris or Dion, do you have any thoughts around this?
I have some nascent thoughts. They're certainly not as well developed as yours since you actually have scaled up. I mean, so I am thinking about it right now. I'm still a pre-seed company working out of a lab, raising to go to the next scale. I mean, so it is something I have put a lot of thought towards. For us, I guess I'll give some fun information around the space, at least to the audience here. So we're technically biomanufacturing, right? So my whole technology is fermentative, and historically in the space in biomanufacturing in general, and also specifically for biomanufacturing commodity materials, capex has been a huge challenge, and it has been part of the reason that predecessors and other similar, even very like great success stories, folks who have raised, Series B, Series C, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars have sunk. And so I unfortunately don't have like, oh, and here's how to fix that. I hopefully will come up with it soon, but I can tell you that, it's a risk that I'm cognizant of. I'm looking at, as far as like fermentative capex, like whatever your biomanufacturing process is, you probably have something before fermentation. You definitely have a purification after fermentation, and a lot of those are set. But for technologies like ours example, we have some latitude in how fermentation can occur. And so like I'm looking at how I can modify what types of equipment we'll use there to reduce capex. And then there's the question about scale up, right? So it's like I don't want to be putting down $10 million green fields for temporary stages of product development. And so thinking about how we can leverage CMOs, like we're in biomanufacturing. So Illinois has like a bunch of potential CMOs that we could leverage for temporary stages of production. So for me, my commercial scale is, 2,000, 5,000 tons per year of product. I do need to have a scale where we're producing 100 tons per year. And so it wouldn't make sense for me to build and own a facility to create, 100 ton per year manufacturing. That's probably best put on a CMO where we're just going in, achieving this milestone, proving out that it works with customers in a drop-in fashion, and then we keep going. So these are some of the ways, at least I'm thinking about it. I'm sorry if that doesn't really answer your question, but hopefully my ramblings can illustrate the space.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you're absolutely right about companies that have folded at the point of getting to scale, um, and like some ways to kind of think about that. And Gabriel put some additional piloting facilities in the Q&A, so folks can kind of see that. Um, there was a question around sending samples to customers and kind of attaining LOIs with specs, volumes, and prices. And or did you use like product performance to move forward with LOIs and co-develop products? And then how to protect your IP. I can talk about that a little bit and what we did. So, for us, like it was hard to send samples because we are um, initially we were making carbon monoxide. So in kind of those early days, what we would do to kind of like validate our technologies, we would send it to a third party to actually test. Like we would send our reactor to these like R&D labs with corporate partners, and they would test our reactor to see that it could produce the CO. Later on, we did actually make the end products ourselves. So we worked with kind of a real small contract manufacturer to, you know, we actually made polymers. We made polyurethane foam. We made jet fuel. We made lenses and sunglasses. So we could actually make these parts in conjunction with customers. But at that point, we developed a relationship enough to where that was almost like a paid. It was like NRE, a paid kind of pilot. And so prior to that, while we were, just in our producing carbon monoxide phase, we would definitely go after getting LOIs, and we would leverage grants that we were applying to, because a lot of times grants will require a letter of support or letter of intent, which is called. And so we'd approach a customer and we'd say, hey, we've been talking for all this time. We're applying for this grant. It'll help us get funding to reach a certain spec, and we would, write the LOI for them and put in there some performance points they would like to see. Sometimes it was cost based, sometimes it was um, performance of some type, or in our case, like purity was a concern that we had to show that we had a certain purity of our molecules. Um, so those LOIs were super helpful to kind of build the relationship to where by the time we then had actual products that we could sell, we'd already had many, many touch points with the customers for these like um, you know, lower entry milestones, which an LOI is definitely one of those. Um, and then I don't know, Chris and Dion, do y'all have any comments on that?
Uh, yeah, I think for us, we're also, trying to work with like our industrial partners and then trying to, get these like LOIs. I think LOIs can be important because like sometimes it will include like, the performance requirement of your products into the LOI. Basically, that also help you, basically set out your goal for your R&D or for your technology development. So you know clearly, like what direction you need to go and then what basically performance requirements you need to achieve in order for the materials to be used by these like partners or customers. So I think they are like definitely very important. And then I think the question is also about like, how to protect your IP when you provide these materials. So I guess like, definitely, sign NDA and then MTA, basically material transfer agreement before you send out the materials. And then, but sometimes, we all know that, NDA and MTA is all about like, papers. So I think what's more important is actually about like the trust. Do you trust like, the company that you partner with or like you are sending materials to that you can like trust them or not? I think, if you are trust them enough and then they are gonna be your long time partners for this, I think it is definitely, you need to send the materials to them and then you kind of like move this partnership forward. But if it's just like a one-time thing and then you are not so sure about like the partnership, then I guess like it also depends on like your material or your product. How difficult it is to reverse engineering your materials, this kind of like question. Yeah.
Awesome. Um, One follow-up question that could be quickly answered around LOI and including price. So Thomas asked us. So yes, in the early days, when we were writing our LOIs, we were looking to sell the molecules, and so we had talked to someone at a gas distribution company and asked like, what are you seeing for the molecules at these different scales? Because for this commodity market, there's a merchant market and then there's a tonnage market. So there was these different markets that we could really get the firm pricing, and kind of wrote this LOI like if we could show that we could hit this price, they'd be interested. And then we could show in our grant then like how we would reach that price and how we would change our performance. Now, there's kind of a unique situation where we're selling molecules. As we went later on, we did not. It was not a price in the LOI per se. It was more kind of performance and volume and purity and so forth. But that is certainly um, kind of if you can speak kind of high level to it and include the unit economics, it could be a possibility. So we have 3 minutes left. There's one question about doing this in their garage. Do you think you'd be able to build something like your technology in the garage without university or public grant support? I can say definitively no for my technology. You need to have a lot of safety equipment, dealing with, pressurized gases and all the things that a lab environment provides in terms of safety. I also think too, I mean, you know, especially being in Silicon Valley, you hear this like the lore of the founders who were in their garage and they were, programming away, then they became Google or whatever. And so I think for deep tech, it's really challenging to like have that progression happen. Um yeah, it's oftentimes like if you have something exciting and that's like a game changer, then there should be partnerships that you could form to like help get into a lab space and build it. And if that's not the case, then I would kind of like, again maybe do some customer discovery to understand like why is this not something that is being adopted like in this local partnership ecosystem. I don't know, Chris and Dan, any thoughts on that and any
I
final
just want to
words?
add real quick along the lines like, can you do it in your garage? Like, can you do it with nothing? And I'll say no, potentially no, but you can keep the idea alive. Like I'm a biotechnology. I need a lab. I didn't have a lab for 3 years, and I managed to keep this company alive. And I started last year. I had 2 people on my team, and now I have like 13, 14, something like that. I'm losing track. So I think in some ways, whatever your technology is, whatever your idea is, there's a path. You just got to stick through to it.
Yeah, I would say for us, it's possible because like our reaction is like it can happen at room temperature and room pressure, and we don't really use like hazardous chemicals. So I think it's safe to do, in your garage. But I think the more important thing sometimes is about like the knowledge because sometimes for deep tech, I think without my PhD training, I probably won't have like a deep understanding of like the technology or the process. So I think if you have the knowledge, I think you may be potentially, develop something exciting in your garage or even in your kitchen, right? But sometimes I feel that for deep tech, like the knowledge and the experience is also kind of like important. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, with that, we're at the top of the hour, so we'll say goodbye to everyone. Thanks so much again for coming and listening to our conversation around commercializing carbon tech.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tasha.
Thank you, Tasha.
Chris at the end.